Alright, I decided to make this video because I thought it'd be fun, and since no one else seems to have done a video in detail, I thought it would be kinda interesting. Then I got incredibly sick for a majority of January and made a video that I thought was going to be simple into something that's taken more than a month. At certain points I had lost my voice and waited a few days, recorded, lost it again, waited a few more days, and so on. So if there's points that I sound sick, I apologize. I actually still feel a little bit sick, but I'm also tired of waiting around and I just kind of want to finish this video by now. Now, seeing how incredibly long this video is going to be, I decided to separate it into two videos. The first video being about stances, attacks, and such like that, while the second video is going to be more about his armor and weapons and any other extras I can throw in. Now, I'm no expert and I don't claim to be, so if you find anything that's wrong with the video or incorrect, let me know in the comment section below, and if you have any source material, that will be even better. But that's enough of introductions. Let's go ahead and start the video. In the first section, we'll be talking about the Warden stances. The Warden has 4 stances, and you might be wondering how there can be 4 stances when the game only has 3 directions you can guard in. Well, yes and no. They have a 3-directional guard system, but the way the Warden stands is in 4 different stances. The Warden has 2 high guard stances and 2 low guard stances, and the low guard stances in particular are shown in both German and Italian longsword fighting manuals. Now, I practice German longsword fencing, so I'm going to refer to them in those stances just because it makes it a little bit more easier for me, even though I'm fairly certain that if the Warden was either of the two, he'd be Italian, mostly because the iconic default helmet is the visored Barbuda helmet, which originates from Italy, and that he speaks Latin, which also originates in the Italian region, and is phonetically close to Italian for the most part, but I digress. For his right low guard stance, he's in Pflug guard, or Plow guard in English, and the Italian version would be called Posta Breve. For his left low guard, he is in the left Plow. For his right high guard, they chose something very interesting. They chose a guard known as Schlussel, or key guard. It's specifically something that you'd see in Meyer's longsword fencing, and I find it very interesting because it's something that doesn't really work with how he fights, but I'll get to that later on. And he's also in Schlussel for his left high guard as well. Now, as far as I understand it, the Schlussel guard is exclusively a German guard, so I guess that blows my whole Italian theory out of the water, huh? Also, a little side note about key guard is that when you're using it, the edge of your sword is actually supposed to be pointing down into your arm, and that wouldn't actually hurt you because you're wearing a padded coat most of the time, but I just find it funny and noted that it is actually in the game incorrect, I suppose. As for his guard form, I'd say for a video game is passable. It's not perfect, and in a real fight, I doubt anyone's would be. My footwork is still terrible in the heat of things, but if we were to try to actually use some of his technique in reality, it'd just need only a little bit of improvement. So the footwork. It's not that bad in my opinion. The important part is to keep your front foot pointed at your opponent and your secondary foot planted for stability in the back. It's also better to keep your secondary foot slightly at an angle, about like 45 degrees, which he does do for the most part. But the most important part about your footwork is that you need to continue through with your strikes, because the last thing you need to do is become unbalanced at the moment you make contact with your opponent. But we'll get to his footwork with strikes when we move on to cuts. For now, this is okay footwork for a stance. As for the body positioning, I'd say it's good enough. Again, it's not hard to look good staying still, so you'll definitely see a different change when we move on to his cuts. One thing I can say is that it looks like he's distributing his weight very evenly, which is good. So he's leaning forward to brace himself for any sort of attack, but he's also spread his weight evenly across the 3 points of contact when he's standing there. His front foot, the ball of his back foot, and the heel of his back foot. And really, when it comes to the distribution of weight and posture and stuff like that, it's more along the lines of what you can do biomechanically as a person. When you're fencing, take the guards into an idea that it's like guidelines, but if you can't do something specifically that won't work for you biomechanically, then don't do it that way, and do it the way that makes you feel more comfortable. Now we move on to one of the most vital parts about dueling someone, in my opinion, is posing a threat. You'll hear that a lot, especially if you get into fencing and stuff like that, is that if you're not posing a threat, then the opponent can just step in and basically kill you. And you know what they say, the best defense is a good offense. In this scenario, what I mean is his sword pointing at the enemy? This is kind of a hard question here because sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. If we look right here, it doesn't look like it is if we're looking through the eyes of the Warden, but it kind of works a little bit. And one thing that we do have to take into consideration is when they're in a stance for staying still for a bit, the idle animation shuffles around a lot. They shuffle their feet, adjust their neck, hunch down or stand up straight, stuff like that. And sometimes I feel like that throws off their sword point a bit. As you'll see in this clip, you'll see the Warden go into the animation for his guard stance, then hunch down a little bit because he's getting in line with the enemy. But if you do it before he gets in line with the enemy, and then stop it like I did, then look through the eyes of the Warden, you'll see that the sword point is pointed straight up, while the enemy's sword point is pointed at my chest for the most part. This next clip is also interesting because I let him hunch down and then you could see his sword swing a little bit side to side. The point's not actually pointing at him, and then when I finally stop it, even though he's hunched down and should be aiming at the enemy, the point is still not pointing at the enemy. Now this just shows that sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, because I thought, well, this one looks pretty good, so I'm going to check it. I go into the Warden's eyes, I see, and it's not close enough. But if I look at the female Wardens, I was like, this one looks closer, and then look at this. It's almost pointing at my neck. This just shows that it does line up sometimes. It's just based on the idle animation, and I'm sure it'd line up for my player, but I don't have any footage of it coming through my Warden, so it is what it is. This one's actually not that bad. It's kind of pointing in the enemy's direction. The shoulder, but I mean, at least it's threatening their shoulder compared to threatening the air. So overall, are the stances posing a threat? I'd say yeah. I know the animations don't always line up properly, but for the most part, I feel like they do. Now, would I choose to replace any of the guard stances? Yes, but only the high guards. For his plow guards he has, I think they're good enough and they look kind of cool in my opinion. But as for the Schlussel guard, I think that it's not being used for its true purpose. I mean, it looks cool, don't get me wrong, but he has no reason to be using that guard. The reason why these guards would be effective in a real sword fight is because the point is actually pointing at the enemy, creating a threat that if they were to advance, they would most likely get stabbed. But the Warden doesn't have any thrusts, so that basically means that even in these pointed at guards, he then has to raise his sword up to perform a cut, because he doesn't stab, even though all of his swords have a sword point on them. So if I were to choose an actual guard stance that would fit the cutting-oriented style of fighting that the Warden does, I would choose Vomtog, or from the roof in English. Now, as you can see, there's many different types of Vomtog represented in historical manuals. Ones that you could see are ones that are above the head, and then there's some where it's closer down towards your chest. Any of them would really work as a viable guard stance for going into high guard for throwing cuts, but I thought to myself, what if they just couldn't do that? I mean, we also have to take all of this into a gameplay perspective. Some things just don't work out well. So I thought, well, maybe they can't go into a guard that has the sword point going above his head, even though the cuts definitely go up and above his head. So I tried looking at it as a perspective from other sword wielders in the game, and wouldn't you know, they have guards that can go up above their head, which makes sense for the type of attacks that they do. For the Orochi, his high guard looks like it's going into Joden no Komai, which is a high guard for kendo users. I'm not a kendo user, so I wouldn't really know much about that, but that's from what I've seen is what it's called. And then if we look at another vanguard, the Kensei, he actually has what you could consider 3 high guards in total. He has Hasu no Komai for both of his side guards, and then he has what I can't find in Kendo as a guard name, but what I know as what looks like Wrathguard or Zornhaus in German. So what does this all mean? Well, with their swords raised up, they're already in a good position for a cutting attack. And if the person they were opposing were to underestimate the length of the sword, they might try to close the distance and create a perfect opportunity to be cut. I myself have actually gotten a few hits off when fencing that when they thought that they were far enough away from my blade, I'd forward step along with a cut and I'd be able to land my hit successfully. Now we'll be moving on to the Warden's blocks and parries. I decided to put this at the end of the stances because it didn't make sense to have it in its own section and it didn't feel right in any of the other sections. Now for the first part, the static block, There's not much interesting to say about it. The only interesting thing I see is that when you throw a light attack, you get staggered back, but when you throw a heavy attack, the enemy gets staggered back. Obviously, that's for gameplay reasons. But one thing that I find very interesting, especially when you throw a heavy attack to like the side or something like that, is that it's kind of like a very lousy deflectional parry in fencing. So it's like they're trying to stop it and then let it glide aside to dissipate the energy away from them, but then they don't follow it up with anything or do anything about it, and their footwork is also terrible. You can see in this part right here where as I'm proceeding to throw a heavy attack, they're just kind of going into an oh shit kind of pose as they try to stop the blade from about to hit them. Now here specifically the footwork isn't that bad, but it's when they get hit and they start stumbling back is when the real problem sets in. Now onto what the game defines as a parry. I actually quite like what they did here, because in a normal sword fight you wouldn't be needing to do these kinds of parries that the Warden does, but the ones that the Warden does do would be effective against something that would be heavier, like as if you're going to be fighting against someone who was using a halberd or a kanabo or something that's, you know, very top heavy as a weapon. You would need to brace yourself and then throw the weapon aside. Talhofer actually shows this type of parry in one of his treatises, in which you would use it to prevent someone from hitting you with a Mordhau, which is inverting their sword, and then striking you with the hilt in the attempt to either just straight up bludgeon you or dent armor for the most part. Now, would it make sense to use this type of parry against the Warden, who has the same weight weapon and shouldn't be that top heavy, even though I'm quite convinced that the Warden's sword is actually a club, but we'll get onto that in the weapons. No, I wouldn't think that that would be that necessary, but that would mean individual animations for each characters fighting certain characters, and that's too much. I think this is a great animation for a parry, considering the other weapons. Alright, 11 minutes in, and we're already getting on to the second section, cuts. I apologize in advance for the length of this video, but I wanted to be thorough. Now, specifically I called this section cuts because that is basically the extent of his attacks. Exclusively, it's cuts. The only two things that are not cuts are his guard break and his shoulder bash. As a matter of fact, let's start out with the non-cuts first, just to get those out of the way, because they're not that interesting, actually. For his guard break, he actually goes for what looks like an upward pommel strike to what's supposed to be the face, but if you look closely, it kind of just looks like he's hitting him in the chest with a pommel. That won't do much good, especially if a person's wearing armor, but even if they're not wearing armor, just a simple padded coat would really nullify the effect of a pommel strike. Pommel strike's supposed to be disorientating, if anything, if it's not actually meant to bludgeon or kill someone. So the idea that hitting someone in the chest with a pommel would actually stop them is kind of ridiculous. I mean, you'd probably have a better chance of just doing a straight punch to the gut if you're trying to do something like that. And then his options whenever he goes into a pommel strike guard break are to either kick the person away, which makes sense, I guess, if you're trying to go for a throw, or to throw them by throwing them to the right or the left by just grabbing them by the shoulder and then moving them. But the interesting one that I really think is the best out of all of them is the throw behind. The throw behind, you hook them with the back end of your hilt and then bring them around. That's actually a move that you could feasibly use if you're trying to do a takedown. So if they were going to be off balance like that, you could throw them to the floor and then proceed to finish them off with your sword or the dagger, or tell them to yield, or whatever you needed to do for that certain scenario. And I also won't knock them for the idea that the pommel strike isn't really on the face, because again, the animations tend to be a bit off for these characters because they're all kind of the same height. I mean, if you look at the size of Peacekeeper compared to Lawbringer, it's just going to be like night and day. And one stands up straight and one hunches down, and it's all mixed up. So it makes sense that it doesn't hit quite right, but it looks close enough. Alright, time to move on to the infamous shoulder bash. This thing, it's not that good as a offensive idea in a duel, because the biggest problem that you have with it is that you can just step aside, and while you're doing something like charging it up, quote unquote, like this, it kind of just leaves your entire body open. I understand that in a real scenario, if he was wearing armor, that's not really that big of a problem, but why go for a shoulder bash when you could just hit him with your pommel if you got close enough, or just push him or shove him? Why does it have to be your shoulder? Because you put so much effort behind running up and trying to hit someone with your shoulder. If you were to miss, you'd just fall down. Or in this game's case, if you were to miss, you just get a guard break off, and then that would be bad. I hate the idea that they put the Master Swordsman as a guy who just uses his shoulder constantly. I really want them to put something else, because I feel like there's so many better options that they could choose, and I'm pretty sure that no one likes it as a mechanic either. So I think that they could do something a lot better than just having a shoulder bash. And as what I've seen with a lot of the other characters is that you either have the ability to bash someone and then just continue to bash them, or you have the ability to like soft feint and have some sort of way of like faking someone out to open up their guard. You need some way to open up someone's guard, and I think that they shouldn't focus on making him some sort of bash orientated character, and rather making him more focused on the ability that he could use his sword and like cut people and soft feint in different ways. I mean, the Tiandi's able to use his sword in a way that he could like feint people out and stuff like that, so that would be interesting if they could just completely change the character that way. But I think that some people might be upset that they wouldn't have access to the ability to just spam shoulder bash all day, which is fair, I suppose. But I mean, if sacrificing the bash would create a more in-depth and more creative character, then I totally support it. And I mean, like, if you like bashing people, just go play Conk. Moving on, we'll be doing a light attack cut from High Guard. This one is quite interesting, and I don't want to be too nitpicky about it because it is a video game. So overall, at first glance, it's not bad. It's definitely what I would consider a successful cut, but there are certain things about it that don't make it as good as a proper cut would be. The cut the Warden specifically uses, and for most cuts as well, I would consider a Zornhaus, although there are many interpretations of what a Zornhaus should be or could be, and I don't want to get into the specifics between Lichtenauer and Meyer, but it's pretty much unanimous agreement that a diagonal cut, usually downwards, would be considered a Zornhaus. So in this case, I will also consider it a Zornhaus, for lack of a better term, of course, because you wouldn't want to throw a Zornhaus from Schlussel anyways. Moving on to doing 2 light attacks from the top, it's going to be 2 Zornhaus, and one thing that's interesting is with the first light attack, even if you don't continue with the second one, the footwork, it switches so that you're doing a forward step along with the cut, which increases the power of your cut. And I'm glad that they kept that small detail. And then what's also interesting is that instead of doing another forward step cut along with it for the second attack, it's just a little simple step forward, which is also reasonable considering that you're just like comboing in another cut. So it's, you know, like if the first one whiffs and you want to throw in a second one, but you've already closed the gap, there's no reason to do another forward step along with it. Just try to throw the second cut. Moving on to the lower guards light attacks. They would also be what I consider a Zornhaus, although they aren't as diagonal as the other ones. They're more towards the middle, which is actually worse for a cut because that leaves your guard a little bit more open and a lot harder to parry certain things, but semantics, and they're not really that important for the case of this scenario. Another thing that's very interesting to point out is that they do not forward step along with it. So instead of transitioning the back foot to the front foot, it's just a simple step, shuffling the feet forward just to gain a little bit more distance. Is it a good step in my opinion? Not really, considering that they have to break their form that they have set up, you know, back foot, front foot, and then they all just bring it together in some sort of like weird, not really stable looking position. It also leaves their leg kind of unprotected. Speaking of unprotection though, is that when they swing their sword out, they overswing a lot, and that doesn't make good defense in the long run. If you see here, there's nothing to stop them from taking another sword or any sort of weapon to the face. They couldn't raise their sword fast enough to defend themselves from that position. That's why it's a good idea to swing your sword through the enemy, but make sure that you don't overswing so that you can then return to form. Now for what I consider the most satisfying move out of the Warden's kit is the light attack that you usually get off of a shoulder bash or anything like that. So chop chop. That's probably one of my favorites. The reason I want to show this so much is because it's a very interesting attack. And unlike his other attacks, which are mostly just Zornhaus, this is actually something special because it's Zornhaus in an Unterhaus very quickly. And I think that's the most fluidity the Warden will have out of his entire kit. Is it flawless? Not in my opinion, but it is still very cool. Now time for the technique to get much worse. As we can see here, we're going to move into the high guard heavy attack, And it is extremely telegraphed and wrong in so many ways as an attack. Now, I understand that attacks, especially heavy attacks in For Honor, need to be a lot slower so that they're reactable for the most part. But there's just so much wrong in the form, the base form. And even if this were sped up to be faster, it would still be extremely telegraphed. One telling problem is that they bring their sword all the way back behind them just to throw an Oberhau. Why? There's no need to do that. It can be pointing straight up, and as long as you drop it down, it should have equal or same momentum. Set aside that all the footwork and everything else is also terrible and everything like that, but if we were to take this and say that hypothetically it would do more damage, why would you open yourself up like that? In this upcoming clip, I show how this can be a very big problem if you leave your guard open. This is kind of cool because it looks like he's about to throw his Zornhaus. That's not the point. The point here is that when you throw your guard up high, you have to also be defending yourself at the same time. So it's not good to be in a high guard for a very long time. And well, other than the fact that he's also levitating off the ground, he has the enemy's sword point right in his face. If he just steps forward a little bit more, he would get stabbed in the face or neck or chest or anywhere that would be very unpleasant to be stabbed. And yes, I understand that if we're even going more realistic, that he is wearing armor, so that should protect him from a stab, but again, his sword's behind him. So that means that he would be susceptible to almost any attack right now, including, you know, a stab to the eyes, through the eye slit, or just being grappled, pommel strike, anything. So there's literally no reason to put your sword behind you like this. So actually, I was in the middle editing and I thought to myself, I was like, this whole entire scenario seems really familiar to me. I don't know where I'm feeling it from, but I was just thinking, and then it came to me where exactly this scenario is particular to For Honor. So if you've been playing For Honor as long as I have, you probably remember this. This is the E3 2015 trailer for Honor. Yeah, this is old, but I remember this scene because I remember it stood out to me and I was just like, why would you do that? And it totally portrays why you don't want to do what the Warden does. So the clip in particular starts right here. The knight gets a drop on the samurai, and I'm just going to let it play out and then I'll give my thoughts on it afterwards. What did he think would happen? The funny thing is if he kept his sword in front of him, he probably could have parried the thrust in the first place. Instead, he just throws him against the wall, and then your boy just yells, "Die" at him. Like, I don't even know which one's funnier, the logic of this scene or the fact that this dude sounds like Skeletor. One last thing before we get back to the topic at hand, I find this scene also very funny from a gameplay perspective because the Warden obviously gets the wall splat on the Orochi, but he still can't get the top heavy off. Even Yubi knows that Warden's top heavies are basically the most predictable attack in the world. Yubi, I want a new rework. Oh, but it gets worse. What could be worse than exposing your neck to a longsword? Doing it twice. Because obviously, when you do it once, you want to twirl and then try to do it again, because that will make it successful. To be fair, again, pop culture, video game, I get it, twirling. All the characters pretty much twirl for the most part, but it doesn't make it any less ridiculous. The thing is, I don't even know where the idea of committing to a strike meant that you had to fully spin your entire body. I don't know where that came from because it doesn't make any sense. You don't see lumberjacks twirling around trying to hit a tree by swinging their entire body. All you need to do is just rotate your torso, and the best way to do that is to step forward along with the swing. I mean, if you were fighting this Warden, what's to stop you from just sticking out your weapon and just waiting for them to impale themselves while they're having their ballerina recital over here? And look, I understand that there may be cases where you find yourself with your back to your opponent, but you shouldn't intentionally put yourself in that position. As you could expect, the side heavies are just as bad. They're not the Oberhau kind of attack like the top heavy were, but they are Zornhaus that are just really drawn out and extremely telegraphed. And then guess what the two hit combo is? You got it, it's more twirling, but with Zornhaus now. And you can expect the same thing from the other side as well. Now moving on to Valiant Charge, which is the Warden's dashing attack, is quite poor. There's a lot of stumbling for some reason, and then kind of catching their balance right at the end. One thing I haven't talked about yet is that when you're using a sword, one thing you need to pay attention for is edge alignment. And that's where the blade is going to make contact with your target, and if it will actually bite in and go through, or if it's going to end up, not cutting. Using a full-length longsword with both hands, you should be fine. Using a full-length longsword with only one hand, and you might not get the edge alignment that you want. In Valiant Charge, you could obviously see that they're only using one hand, which isn't going to end well for them. Another thing that won't end well for them is the same problem that they had with the shoulder bash, is that if you were to just step out of the way, you're going to end in a very bad position. And the same thing with the sword not coming back into a defensive stance. This isn't the only attack only using one hand, because obviously if you've played Warden, you'll know one of the better things in his toolkit is his zone. And yes, this also uses one hand, although this might be a little bit more plausible, as it seems like it's more of a draw cut against the target. Doesn't make it good, but more viable than Valiant Charge. But there's actually one really underlying problem with using this in a realistic practical duel. What's to stop them from just taking your sword? Because if you don't have a good enough grip on your sword, let's say they were to block it right when it makes contact, you only have one hand on your sword now. They could pull it out if they put both their hands on it, hell, even just one hand. If you could grab it from the crossguard as well, that's even better. And even better yet, if you're on the other side of the guard, you do a twirl, because why not throw a twirl in as well? What's funny is I think I've actually even seen fencing footage of someone trying to do a twirl in a practical sense, and they always just get themselves stabbed. I can't show any of it because of creative license and stuff like that, but I'm fairly certain that there's footage out there, if you want to look it up, of someone that's trying to do a twirl and just gets stabbed in the process. But they're not all bad, and in fact I saved the best for last. In fact, I might even go as far to say that it's impressive. It's the move that you almost never get to use as Warden, and it's Crushing Counterstrike. There's a few things that make Crushing Counterstrike impressive, one of them being how he parries the attack, and then how he then executes his own attack. Alright, without giving you the maximum amount of information that you need to know about fencing, there's a certain thing called tempo, and that's the idea behind every move that you can make in a certain amount of time, your opponent can make the same amount of moves. So, with that idea in mind, your attacks should be both offensive and defensive, attacking the enemy while also keeping you protected. Why is it important to talk about that? Well, because this is basically the only move the Warden does that does do this. He starts off by blocking the attack, and because he's already in a position to go for a half-swording attack, he then does that, thus defending himself and creating an opening in a single movement. The form of this strike is not that bad either. As you can see, when I go to attack, the female Warden braces her block with her forearm, which puts her in a perfect opportunity to then slide her hand over and go in for a half-swording attack. As for the strike itself, in my opinion, it would have been a lot cooler if she then half-sworded and went for a jab instead of a slash, because a jab would be more opportune instead of a slash, and it works against armored opponents too, for the most part. Going for a stab underneath their armpit or in their neck or something like that is a lot more controlled while half-swording, so I thought that would have been a lot nicer if they did that, but beggars can't be choosers. So as for where the Crushing Counterstrike ends up, from what it seems like when I freeze frame it and then pan around, it looks like what's actually happening is they half-sword, put it above or behind their neck actually, and then push down against their neck, which brings their whole body down with it. So basically what it looks like is they're sawing the enemy's head off with their sword, which the more that I think about is incredibly badass. Like, why is this not an execution yet? Could you imagine, like, you pommel strike them in the gut so they bend over and then you're just like, incumbe, and you just take their head off? That would be awesome. Yubi, get on that. Although then again, maybe I'm wrong, like I said, the animations are kind of wonky sometimes. If you see here, it doesn't look like it's at the head, but then again, it looks like the attack hasn't registered yet. But another reason why I wanted to show this is because it kind of looks like how what I wanted the crushing Counterstrike to be, is like push them away and then go for the half sword stab underneath the armpit or something like that, which is something that was shown because that's one of the weak spots of most armored suits. Alright, and that about wraps it up. An in-depth analysis of every attack, stance, and what have you by the Warden. And it's about 30 minutes long. So could you imagine if I tacked on the armor and weapons and everything else onto this video as well? Yeah. But I am looking forward to doing the weapons and armor because that does sound fun. But as for this video, if you made it through the entire 30 minutes, thank you very much. It took quite a bit of time to compile this all together and actually do the editing and the gameplay, so it means a lot that you sat through all of this. Also, like I said earlier, if you find anything that is incorrect, please let me know. I am always ready to learn something new. Questions, comments, concerns, prophecies, current events, anything you'd like to tell me, you could put in the comment section below. I will most likely be reading it. But if that's it, then thank you all for watching, and I hope you guys have a nice day. Peace.